Hi, my name's Ari Flagle, and I'm fascinated with Boelens pythons. For the last 16 years, I've been traveling to the remote areas of West Papua New Guinea and Papua New Guinea, searching for this elusive snake, to study these animals in the wild, and to gain as much knowledge as we possibly can. So join me and my guests on the Boelens Python Roundtable.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Boelens Python Roundtable. I am your host, Ari Flagle, and this is episode 5. I'm going to be joined tonight with a friend in the UK, actually, which is pretty awesome. So let us welcome Paul Aherne-Conroy. I'm sorry, Paul.
Yeah, that's it.
Good, man. First off, thank you so much for coming on, and also thank you for coming on when we set up the time, because I know it's like 1 or 2 in the morning where you're at right now in the UK.
Yeah, it's just turning midnight, actually. I think we're 6 hours ahead. But yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. Yeah,
my the pleasure is all mine. I know we've known each other for a bit. Obviously, we're going to know each other longer because we share the same passions and what we work with. But we, started communicating with each other, I'd say early on this year, when you started working with your Boelens and you started having some success. So, which is exciting. But before I get into all the, what all the viewers hopefully are really, really wanting to hear, I want to kind of get to know you more, let everybody know who we're talking to and kind of see where your passions kind of start from, and a little bit of your back. So when did you really first start getting interested in reptiles? I mean, I know it's such a hokey question. Everybody asks it, but it's, we all have that, we can all remember when we started as kids, so, but yeah, let us know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, from a young age, so 40 years ago now. I'm just coming up 50, and I would have been sort of 7 or 8 when my brother and I started. We'd always been interested in animals, and we started focusing on snakes and lizards when we read books about wildlife. And living in the UK, we don't have a very rich herpetofauna here, but we do have some species. And our house backed onto a railway embankment, and we would see common lizards there in the spring and summer, and that was really exciting for us. And we always dreamed of seeing snakes in the wild, and started trying to persuade our parents to let us keep exotic pets. And when we were, I think, 9 and 7, they allowed us to keep a garter snake each. And really, it just went from there. And I pretty much, apart from a short break in my late teens, when I was sort of discovered other things, I've been keeping snakes pretty much continuously since then.
Oh, that's fantastic. That was the Natrix, right?
Well, the grass ones that we wanted to see, absolutely, locally, yeah. The first species we kept were North American garter snakes, Thamnophis sitalis.
Very, very cool. Yeah, I know, because I've been to Europe a number of times, and I know, when I've been out tromping around, I'll get super excited when I see those grass snakes, because there's right. European and stuff like that, but there's still such a cool snake species to see. What's absolutely. So obviously you said you've been working with reptiles for a very, very long time, and you started off as younger with you and your brother. What was and what is currently the herpetocultural kind of scene or environment like in the UK, as far as if you could compare it to the US or any other countries?
Well, as actually we were just saying when we were chatting before you started recording, I'm not sure that I'm that close to the herb scene in the UK, really, and especially not these days. So I'm probably a little bit of a sort of loner outsider, really, and I'm not too aware of the zeitgeist in terms of what people are keeping. I mean, having said that, I have a few friends in the hobby, including people who are in the commercial side of it, who run stores or who breed professionally, and I see the kind of things that they're doing. And obviously, for many years, the whole Royal Python morph scene was huge. I mean, going back 20 years or so. Partly, I suppose, I see things through the lens of what's interested me. And for a long time, what I was really passionate about were the boa constrictor complex, and particularly locality boas. So I was very interested in not the morph so much, but actual animals with provenance that you could trace the lineage of from particular locations in Central and South America, and also from some of the Caribbean islands. I was fascinated by those.
Cool.
Kept those for a long time, and they were my passion when it came to breeding too. The Boelens side of it, really, it just came about because they were always, I think they were kind of everyone's bucket list species. And I would occasionally ask a contact of mine who worked at a reptile store in South London if he'd ever get them in. And sorry, I might be getting a bit ahead of myself here because you hadn't asked about the Boelens, but
it's yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, one day he said they were getting an Indonesia shipment in. So a sort of mixture of wild caught and captive farmed animals, I think. And I popped in and I just said, "Oh, you don't have Boelens, do you?" In fact, I think I knew so little about the species at the time. I think I pronounced it wrong. I said Boelens or something. And he said, "Yeah, we do," and showed me some. And, you know, they were very expensive, way more than I'd ever paid for snakes. But the idea of keeping them was just fascinating to me. So I was able to persuade my wife to let me buy a pair of his captive farmed, and yeah, that was 7 years, well, more than 7 years ago now.
Wow, that's yeah, I'm sure being, you know, having animals like to that, you know, not, I don't want to use the word caliber, but to that level, I guess, of rarity and just the lack of information and, you know, experience was pretty monumental at that moment when you had that opportunity, I'm sure. It was really interesting. I kind of want to jump back a little bit because you said you were really interested in a lot of the boids, especially like the Caribbean stuff and all that. You know, were there other animals like prior to you getting into the Boelens that you were really heavily working with? And was this more or less just like passion projects that you enjoyed working with this, or were you doing this as basically like a business where you were fueling your passion with, you know, selling offspring or you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah. Well, to be honest, I've always been pretty small scale. I mean, even at the height when I was breeding the largest amount of animals, I probably never had any more than 50 individual snakes at any one time, and that would have been when, you know, litters had dropped. So, you know, I'm a pretty small player. And I bred boas sort of going back 15 years ago until a few years ago. You know, and I would sell those, but, you know, we're talking a few dozen animals a year really that I would breed. So yeah, I'm not I've never been in it professionally. It's always been from the perspective of a hobbyist and someone interested in wildlife ecology more generally. And yeah, it's always been, I guess, just a way to feel closer to animals that fascinate me more broadly, not just in the sense of keeping them in captivity, which is great, but you know, the opportunity to see them in the wild, which is, I think, has always been the real thrill, really. I'm always thinking, yeah, when I know you've done a lot of travel yourself, especially to New Guinea, and yeah, there's really, I find nothing more thrilling than actually having a wild encounter with a species, especially if it's a species you've been interested in for years or one you've kept, and then to see it in its natural environment, it's yeah, that's just fantastic.
Yeah, it's always a really thrilling moment, even if it's something that you're not like actively working with, but obviously you're aware of, and you know, you know, and you encounter those animals in these, you know, areas traveling when you leave home, you know, as you know, South America, Central America, things like that, Australia, you know, Asia, all that stuff, New Guinea, and you see something that's, you know, sometimes, you know, very common, you know, that you would see in the pet trade, and then you see it in its integrity, you know, in the wild doing what it does. It's always exciting. I mean, I love seeing green anoles when I go to Florida or something like that. Okay. Or even when I see them in Texas here, it's like, you know, like this afternoon, I found a checkered garter snake on the main path at the house. And I was just like, oh, that's so cool. He was like, you know, it's like, you know, it's just a really nice thing to see. And it brings more appreciation, I think, for the animal. You know, not to knock, you know, anybody else doing any other ways, but, you know, it's like, you know, I know a lot of people utilizing this as an industry in their hobby as well. You know, this is, you know, it's numbers to pay the bills and things like that. And I can respect that. But there's also like a divided line where there's some people that are more like naturalists like yourself and myself that are, you know, we've got very small, you know, niche, you know, collections of certain particular animals we're specifically working with. And, we have other jobs outside of what we do. And this is kind of like passion projects where we're doing it more than just to survive, which, I'm impressed that a lot of people are able to, not that are able to, I shouldn't say that, but a lot of people, make this their living, breeding reptiles, which is fantastic. So they can do both their loves, but it's different in a lot of ways, doing it in a different way. So let's get into the Boelens stuff, because I know that's what everyone wants to hear. So, so your friend, obviously you were in contact with, that had a shop, and he was bringing in Indonesia shipment, and you had some access to some animals. You said this about 7 years ago, and you were able to acquire a pair of babies. What was the moment after that? Like, what did you do? Did you have something preset in preparation, or did you just kind of fly by the seat of your pants at that moment?
Well, I'd heard about Boelens that they were relatively easy to get feeding and to keep healthy as juveniles. They were captive farmed. They were, I guess, no more than sort of 6-7 months old, maybe a little older. They hadn't, they didn't look like hatchlings, but they hadn't been through the full ontogenetic color change. So they were relatively small. I'd heard you could essentially keep them in the same way you might do a carpet python initially, or perhaps not as much heat. I actually kept them in the same way that I did my diamond pythons, because I assume there would be some parallels, because diamond pythons are, well, I don't know if cold weather is the right term, but they live in a part of Australia where they're exposed to more of a temperate climate and some cooler temperatures in winter. And the Boelens, obviously being in the highlands in New Guinea, they experience that too. So I kept them much as I had the diamonds. They were easy to keep from the off. They fed straight away on sort of small adult mice, defrosted adult mice. When I got them, they had a few parasites. They had mites they got from the shipment. They were easy to deal with. I had some fecal samples taken and tested at a vet, and they had some common nematode worms, but they were easy to deal with something like Panicure, I think it was. So it was kind of plain sailing. They were easy to feed. They seemed well adjusted to captivity. They were captive farmed, which I don't know exactly what that means in terms of an Indonesian farm setup. I sort of picture it as like rows of these outdoor cages or something, but I don't know what that's really like. So I guess it's a much more right. Okay, yeah. Well, I guess it's it's a much wilder way of keeping them than anything I could hope to achieve. So I didn't know how well they'd fare, especially after having been transported halfway across the world. But yeah, they adjusted really well, and it was all pretty plain sailing from that point, to be honest.
That's great. It's like I talk to people about Boelens pythons like daily, which is, it's not like a brag or a flex or anything like that. It's just what I do. I love the species. So it's like, it involves my daily life in some way or another. And I remember I talked to a lot of the older generation too, with when they're working with these animals, historically bringing in these larger animals that are obviously collected animals straight from the mountains and stuff like that, and they always have so many, or had so many issues prior to acclimating these snakes. They'd come in so infrequent, the numbers would be very low to begin with, and then obviously coming from their the wild, then going to a supplier, and then going from the transport area, you've got weeks, realistically months before those animals are even landing in where they're supposed to finally stay, essentially. There's so many issues about working with them, not just for the health aspect of it, but obviously with the health too, they're not going to feed a lot of the times. And I feel like, now that we've been fortunately enough that, there are quotas set in place by the Indonesian government and forestry department that allows younger animals to come out of these farms, that they just do so much better in captivity than these larger, older animals. And they just, acclimate so much quicker. The feeding aspect is a huge thing, even though I do know some people that still have some issues with getting, fresh babies to feed. It's usually a wait out game with them, or just, flip in the scent really fast. So they are like, oh, this is interesting. But overall, I think the game has changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years by having these younger animals in our hands, especially in capable people's hands like yourself and so many other keepers that are working with them. The only downside of it is the value that's associated with them too really affects how many people can get involved with these animals to really kind of turn the page, so to speak. It's just very limited, and that's an unfortunate thing that we're just dealing with. So, but you said initially you had a pair of them, right? That you got.
That's right. Yeah, it's a male and female, about the same age. Could one have been
when you had them, they probably were. Yeah. No, you're fine. You're fine. Did you obviously you kept these guys separated as you were raising them up? I assume, right? Yeah. Now, how did you have your how did you raise up these hatchlings? And then at what point did you transition them over to the the young juvenile to young adult kind of phase?
Well, I mean, I keep them in. I kept them in a relatively straightforward setup. I use ceramic heaters. I did have UV light for them, not all the time actually, as they grew and they cycled through different vivarium sizes. Sometimes I had UV, sometimes I didn't. But a setup that would probably be familiar to most snake keepers out there. Yeah, ceramic with a thermostat. Fairly standard substrate hides, gradient within. Much like you might imagine keeping a typical boid, really. And as I say, it was it was all disarmingly straightforward in terms of how they grew and how they fed, and there was nothing about them that made it seem more complicated to keep them than it had been to keep any other species, really. Which I think can be
wonderful.
It's been quite disarming about Boelens, because everything about raising them, I can't speak for everyone's experiences, but they seem relatively straightforward. Which is why the whole thing around breeding them being a challenge seems a bit of a puzzle, really, because in so many ways they seem like they will just get on and breed like any other species, like any other python, perhaps.
Yeah, it really is pretty straightforward with raising them. I know a lot of people are like, obviously, I think there's a huge intimidation factor, as I kind of lightly touched on, with just the monetary value that's associated to the animals. Yeah, so, sure. It's obviously seen as, okay, these are, they're very special, which they are, but for the most part, they're very, very easy to raise. The only difficult aspect of, I think, anything in their husbandry or keeping is maintaining, healthy animals with feeding and then trying to reproduce them. Aside from that, they're very easy to keep. They're very tolerant. If you watch them, they will basically tell you what they like, what they don't like. They're pretty easy animals to read. So it's interesting because I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm really nervous. And I'm like, just treat them like you would any other, like a carpet python or a scrub python. They'll do great for you. Just don't overdo it. Don't, it's like that saying where it's like, kill them with kindness. A lot of times I've heard people do that where they have an issue with their animals because they're just overly mothering them.
That's
interesting. And then, obviously, taking care of, parasites and things like that. It's a reality. And then, it's nice to hear that, you did fecal work on them when you got them, just to eliminate any kind of future health related issues that you might experience, and just to wipe it out like right away. I always tell people, address the health issues as soon as you can, because that way you can take care of it first on, as opposed to dealing with it later down the road, where it might cause more issues to the animal survival, as well as difficulty, as these animals are progressing in your care. So that's nice to hear. I mean, I try to, do fecals and stuff like that when I can, or do, crypto swabs or nido swabs and things like that, just because they're, as we're progressing with technology and in, our husbandry techniques, we have all this, all these things that are disposed now, so might as well use them, for the better of our animals, so it's, but yeah, no, so when you were, do you recall what you were keeping your babies at when you were raising them up, or as they progressed, obviously you increased temperatures and durations of light or whatnot?
Yeah. So temperature wise, if I recall, it would have been around daytime temperatures of around 30 centigrade, which is, I think that's 86 Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And one thing I'd sort of learned over decades of keeping snakes is that it seems to be in their interests in terms of their longevity and their overall health to have a chunk of the day, at nighttime, specifically when they're not exposed to supplementary heat. And even here in the UK, where obviously it can get colder at night, I tend to let most species drop down to an ambient temperature of around sort of 20 degrees, which I guess, I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, maybe, I don't know, 58 or something, but maybe a little higher. But so I think I would have had the heat on for about 10 hours a day at about 86 Fahrenheit. And then I think the heat would have been completely off at night. Just allowing the ambient temperature of the room to come down. I mean, it doesn't get too cool for most of the year because, they weren't kept in this room as babies, but where there are a number of other vivariums that have heaters, the heat builds up in the day and it takes a while to cool down at night. So it never gets freezing. But allowing them to have that sort of day-night cycle. And probably as they grew, it would have been much the same, really. Another thing I kind of learned over the years is not to keep things too hot. I guess a lot of python species would probably be fine if the temperature goes up towards sort of 90, certainly under hot spots or for parts of the day. But I just kind of instinctively err a little bit on the side of caution. I'll probably top out the temperature around 86, 88 Fahrenheit. And that would just be under the heater. And the actual ambient temperature in the rest of the viv will be a good few degrees cooler. I know it's just like an instinctive thing I felt over the years that reptiles can experience some degree of stress if they're overheated, and particularly keeping diamond pythons, as I had done for a number of years. I know they are quite vulnerable to being kept at temperatures that are too high for long periods of time. So I do that kind of almost instinctively for a lot of species, really. I just feel as if it's better for their long-term health and their chances of living out their natural lifespan.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. That's a really good point too, because I do the same with my animals. I have done the same for my animals ever since I've kept them, where you're offering that, we're replicating the natural environment. So obviously, for the most part, there's going to be areas in the environment that are substantially warmer than other areas, and then obviously at nighttime the temperatures are going to drop, and that kind of initiates in that brain, that mindset of that animal. It's like, okay, now it's time for me to go seek out shelter for the night.
Right.
I'm going to maintain the temperature that I absorb throughout the day with me through the night. And it also it lets them kind of, mentally prepare, so to speak, for that reproductive stage later on in their life, where that temperature drop and that, humidity increase or decrease, whatnot, light cycles, those are all factors with reproduction that these animals, will be hopefully experiencing at some age. So it's almost kind of like the precursor of getting them ready down the road. And like you said, it helps create a much healthier animal in the long run. Did you when you were saying that you were trying to stay away from really hot temperatures, did you have any regurgitation issues with animals when they got too warm?
To be honest with you, no, I didn't. I think I had maybe one incident where the female was a sub-adult, and as they grew, they would still only accept mice for a while. It took quite a while to get them onto rats, even though they would greedily accept mice. They didn't want to move to rats. So they got to a point where they could take a lot of mice in one sitting. And I think one time, for reasons I never really worked out, the female, she just suddenly, after having a bunch of mice, it could have been as many as 8 or something, she just suddenly started looking uncomfortable and regurgitated them all in one go. And it was a one-off incident. I really have no idea what triggered that. There didn't seem to be anything going on with her. A bit unpleasant to clean up, but afterwards, I gave her a week off before I tried to feed her again, but she just resumed feeding normally. There was no evidence of any wider health problems, so I'm not sure what went on there. But
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. I know there's a bit of a delay on the thing, so I don't mean to talk over.
Oh no, I mean, it could have also just been the fact that she kind of kind of like gorged herself on that multiple prey items, and then it was just kind of like afterward, he's like that, that fat guy at the buffet, and he ate too much and he steps outside and he throws up,
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
But,
I mean,
no, it's because sorry. Yeah, because I remember speaking with Frederick, and he had told me when he was working with his animals, he had a couple instances with his adults regurging with the temperatures being too warm, but I've never had an issue with that before. That's why I was curious. I like to ask a lot of the keepers the same questions over to see if there's any similarities as well. But that's interesting that didn't happen. And obviously you cleaned it up. You didn't leave it there, right? Or because I know the reason I asked is because I know some keepers that have had an animal regurge and they'll go back and they'll eat the regurged animal, which is absolutely revolting to me.
Yeah, I mean, especially given how unpleasant a python regurgitation smells, it's pretty grim. So no, I sorted that out pretty quickly. But it's interesting what you say about animals experiencing regurgitation, especially when they're young, because when I first started keeping snakes in the 80s, almost everything that was available to buy was wild caught. And they would have been shipped in from, there was a lot of North American stuff, actually, a lot of garter snakes and corn snakes, and they wouldn't always be in the best of health, and you'd see all kinds of health problems that you don't really see with reptiles nowadays. Regurgitation, just random distress, and some of it might have been due to deficiencies in husbandry, because we didn't really know how to keep snakes as well then, and also I was a kid at the time, so I'm sure I made loads of mistakes. But yeah, I kind of, as the decades rolled by, I got used to snakes that I bought just being kind of pristine and always healthy and captive bred and a good weight and having no problems. And with the Boelens, I didn't know if it was going to be like that, because they were captive farmed, and as we talked about earlier, they've been transported a long way. But they really, from the word go, they behaved as if they had been captive bred up the road, and they'd never been subject to any stress. So I think I got quite lucky with that pair all round, really.
It sounds like they were, really healthy animals when you received them, minus just a couple little imperfections that were easy to fix. And those are the kind of things that, as keepers working with, animals of, like rarity or, infrequency, those are the things that we really, it's like, obviously we're dreading when we bring them in. It's like, okay, are they going to have something? We've got to put them in a quarantine process, and it's like a whole gamut of things we're doing. So obviously in that situation, it sounds great. I have an interesting question for you with your food feeding source. Are you getting live mice that are commercially bred, or are you getting frozen that you're thawing out?
Frozen always. Yeah, I think the reptile feeding culture in the UK for decades has been centered around frozen and thawed rodents. I think, funnily enough, you talk to a lot of people in the UK, they will assume that it's illegal or, perhaps immoral somehow to feed live. I don't think that's the case, but people just assume that the only thing it's legitimate to feed reptiles in captivity is frozen and defrosted stuff. So I will just buy a bulk order of rats and mice and whatever else I need for my reptiles. And for the word go, the Boelens were on defrosted mice from commercially sourced. Those white ones that everyone's probably familiar with. I don't really know. I presume they're bred en masse in big farms. So I mean, always pretty straightforward. I've been fortunate. I've never really had Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I got like things popping in my head as you're talking. So, so with your sources of your rodent sources, are there I'm curious if the commercial offering or breeding of rodents in the UK and other parts of Europe are different as far as controlled husbandry. If there's different regulations, are they only offered certain types of food sources as opposed to the US or over in China where they're offering them different things? I'm wondering if obviously if there's any kind of a dietary difference from the animals we're offering our snakes versus the animals that you're offering your snakes over there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. And, because if there were appreciable differences in what prey items are fed and raised on, and that can have all kinds of implications for the for the predators and their health and what they're eating. And I don't know, it's interesting. I've assumed for so long that the frozen rodents I get are just absolutely bog standard, and I just take for granted that they're probably fed some, very homogenous diet, whatever it is. And I've never really thought that much about what they're really fed and how they're bred. So, probably in all honesty, I should have thought more about it. But the sources that I've bought from, I've always trusted them. They tend to be kind of reptile stores or people I know who will source them directly from big commercial farms, and I just kind of take for granted that they're good quality. But yeah, I mean, I guess you never really know what's actually.
I'm always interested in that, just because like I had spoken to Frederick also about it with his animals, with his success too. I'm like, hey, are your rodent sources potentially different? Are they eating something different when they're being bred that is, right, providing something else that we're not offering in captivity with what we're given? Because obviously, quantity is what we're breeding for with our rodent commercially, because, obviously we've got hundreds and hundreds of orders and thousands of rodents to get out. So, and it's expensive too. So I don't know if it's like, the free range version of the frozen rodents, or, if there's, because I know in Europe, just with some of the European reptile expos and shows, there's a lot of different legalities and rules that you have to follow as well, that are different that we have in the US, where we're a lot relaxed on that. And I didn't know if that kind of played in a factor as well as for feeding items like, insects or frozen rodents or quail or things like that, if it was just healthier over where you guys are. Because I mean, I don't know, I always thought about that.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, and it's, to be honest, you've got me thinking about it, because I have just taken it for granted for so many years. I mean, I guess if you are someone who is breeding a prey item, rats or mice, commercially, then you're going to be incentivized to get them up to the right size as quickly as possible. And you're probably not going to be massively concerned about the health of their diet. It's just going to be, are they big enough to get on the market? So it's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess I would kind of assume that if there are more people in the US feeding live, or maybe breeding their own rodents to feed, then perhaps those prey items might have a healthier diet, because the reptile keepers can take note themselves and ensure that the rats and mice are getting a good diet, or maybe even a better quality of life, if that makes any kind of difference. So, yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I have no idea whether it factors into, the health or the reproductive behavior of the snakes themselves. But I guess snakes are very, very generalist, and places around the world where there have been invasive prey items like rats or mice, like old world mammals in Australia, the pythons will adapt quite happily and eat them, or squirrels or something like that. So I guess I just assume snakes are kind of tough enough to, to just get by on any source of protein that will do the job.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's been kind of like, I've thought about it for a number of years, and it's just like, I mean, because like when you compare, animals, obviously, animals in the wild that are feeding off of, wild prey sources, those animals are grazing on certain vegetation, different kinds of plant, grains, things like that, any kind of meats, things like that. So I didn't know if that played a factor, which I'm sure it does in the long run with wild animals, but I don't know if it's really something, that we are looking at more or less in our captives, or these larger companies that are producing rodents. It'd probably be a really cool show topic to do a dietary discussion on, what we're doing on that. Because I mean, obviously, if I was breeding rodents in a large quantity, I'm going to try to get, obviously the healthiest but the cheapest food source, because it's going to be coming out of my pocket with thousands and thousands of little, mouths trying to eat it, as opposed to going to like, the farmer's market and picking up the greatest, the best grains or the best leafy vegetables and things like that. So I wonder often like how that works. I mean, in the US, I don't know, we feed a lot of things hamburgers, it seems like. So it's like, I don't know how healthy that how healthy those, food sources are really, are really. So, but yeah, that sounds like be a cool topic to discuss. That I might probably reach out to a couple of people I know right off the top of my head and do that. So with your prey, with your feeding and stuff, typically, what was your feeding regimen? Like, how often were you feeding your younger animals as they matured? And then before, obviously, we're not going to talk about the breeding aspect yet, but like when they were babies, how often were you feeding them as they started growing? Did you increase? Did you decrease? Kind of stuff like that.
Sure. So as juveniles, it would have been approximately once a week to every 10 days. As they got older, a little bit more irregular. I mean, this is another habit I've picked up over the decades. Just like with the sort of almost instinctively trying not to let the temperature get too high, I just developed this sense that snakes seem to do quite well if they have occasional breaks in their dietary regime. Almost as if, I guess, on some subconscious level, I'm trying to mimic what might happen in the wild, where they might have periods where they can't get hold of a prey item for some time, and they might have to sit it out for a month or so. I wouldn't go a month without feeding them, but I might go 2.5 weeks, something like that, 3 weeks maybe even, and then feed them a little bit more. Just having it be a little bit less regular. I mean, partly, to be honest, that's might reflect me being a little disorganized at times and not always keeping to a strict schedule. But I just have this instinctive feeling that I've picked up over the decades that if you give these animals breaks and you let them have short periods of fasting, I almost have this sense that it's better for their long-term health. And I don't know if there's any science or data to back that up, or if that's just a hunch. But yeah, so as they started getting older, it would have been weekly, but then occasionally fortnightly, maybe even a little longer sometimes, and then just varying the amount they eat based on the interval.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that. That's kind of like my philosophy as well. Obviously, with like neonates and little older babies, the frequency of the prey items are going to be a little bit more frequent, but they're smaller prey items that I'm offering. So like typically when I'm raising babies, like fresh babies, I'm doing like day-old quail chicks. And I'll do a day-old quail chick every 4 to 5 days, and they're like little ones, just to get them to pass that first shed cycle, where they push it a little faster, and then I start to gradually kind of slow down on my feeding as the animals increase the size, just to kind of replicate what it would be like in the wild, where you don't have food handed to you all the time. You're lucky that you find stuff sometimes, and it's exactly. The size is different. Also, it's never going to be a 200-gram rat or a 15-gram mouse or whatever. It's going to be different. You're going to have larger prey items versus smaller prey items. I'm not saying, don't feed your Boelens python and then give it a whole chicken a month later, because, that's not necessarily the right thing to do. But, in the wild, which, I know a lot of keepers, including myself, we try to replicate, the infrequency of things like that are important for the animal's long-term survival. And we want to encourage some active searching for food sometimes as well, as opposed to just sitting there and getting like, a Thanksgiving turkey like stuffed in their face and they don't have to move for it. Which, a lot of people, feeding is fun. People like watching animals feed. So it's like, oh, great, I'm going to feed it and throw it up to the glass,
Exactly.
So at what point was at what time really, or did you really say, I'm going to try to reproduce these now?
So when I got them, I think I'd read somewhere that, I don't know exactly where I read this, but the Boelens in particular might have a fairly elongated path to adulthood and reproductive age and size than some other pythons. So that period of time I had in my head was about 6 or 7 years, and I thought it'll be 6 or 7 years. And actually, I got them in October 2018, and I first thought about pairing them up at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. And I thought, okay, they must be, 6, maybe pushing 7 years old now. I might have got my maths wrong there, but I thought, let's give it a go. Now, I wasn't very hopeful because I'd been told that they're exceptionally difficult to breed, and I just assumed it would be an impossible hill to climb. But I had in my head, let's give it a go once they hit about 6 years old or so, and the right sort of size.
Now, when you made that decision, obviously these animals had been maintained their entire life separate, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they'd never been introduced at all.
They were obviously in the same room, so they could smell each other and all that stuff and everything.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
What was your initial protocol you moved forward with as far as trying to attempt to reproduce these?
So it was, for some reason, I had in my head that the best time to pair them would be coming towards the end of winter in the UK. And actually talking to people subsequently, they tell me that they pair their Boelens sort of in the autumn, sort of September, October. So maybe I got that wrong. But that was the time I thought, let's do it. So I moved the female into an 8-foot vivarium. Oh, sorry, Ari, can you say it again?
When did you decide to pair them again?
So beginning of 2024, so sort of like February 2024 is when I thought I'd do it.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I put the female in an 8-foot vivarium that normally is home to my diamond python pair, and I'd moved them out temporarily. And I let her be on her own there for a few days, and then I introduced the male into there because I thought, okay, it'll smell of the female was what I had in mind. And absolutely nothing happened. He just showed absolutely no interest. So I just thought, well, that's probably par for the course. I'm told these are really hard to breed, so let's leave it. And I think they were in there for a few days and nothing was happening. So I separated them. I left the female in that vivarium for a bit, put the male back in his. And then it must have been a couple of weeks later, he went off his food, which he had never done. They'd always been such reliable feeders. There'd never been a break in that. And I wondered if that could be, a sign that he was ready to court something reproductive. So I reintroduced him to the female, and this time he immediately started courting her. So from that point on, they were, they appeared to be locking. They were, just pretty much together all the time from that period. I guess we're talking sort of late February until the female went into a post-ovulation slough in May.
Wow. Okay. Now, when you after the male, it's interesting you should say the male stopped feeding. I've experienced that with several males also, where they're obviously more interested in the opposite sex than to feed. I've paired animals during that time as well. Did you see, like, when you started putting them together and you started seeing the compatibility working, was the female just kind of like subsiding with everything and very kind of accepting to his advances, or was she doing any kind of body posturing or things like that showed that she was kind of like moving around back at him at all? Or
right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. They did. They both moved around quite a lot. So it wasn't as though they just kind of sat there and he would accept her courting. I mean, I should say I didn't really have much experience with python breeding. For years before then, I'd been breeding boas. Python-wise, the only pythons I'd bred before then was a semi-accidental breeding of royal pythons on a one-off occasion. So I didn't really know what python courting and mating looked like necessarily. But yeah, they moved around the vivarium a lot. She would be kind of stretched out and he would be following her. There'll be a lot of spurring, the spurs all over the back and tickling, his tail kind of flipping around a bit. And then sometimes it seemed like her tail was kind of moving as well in response. So she didn't seem as if she was, she didn't seem as if she objected. I mean, I guess it's hard to read emotions or, you know, intent on the part of
Yeah,
snakes, but she didn't seem distressed. But certainly she was more active moving around during the courtship than she would normally be in the vivarium, other than when she was hungry and looking for food.
Did you see any excessive defecation or urates during introduction or courting or anything like that?
To be honest, no, I didn't notice anything different other than just the courtship itself and the spurring. And I mean, it was fairly, well, I was going to say continuous, but actually it wasn't continuous. They were together for a long period of time, and there would be continuous courtship or spurring for, you know, a couple of weeks, and then it would seem to stop. And sometimes they would be in different parts of the vivarium, and I would think, okay, they're done. And then, you know, the next day I would see them back together again, and the male back courting. So it was kind of on and off throughout that period. But yeah, I didn't notice anything different in terms of defecation or anything like that. You know, behaviorally, it all seemed pretty normal. I do remember he wasn't particularly interested in eating during this period. I think he maybe had a meal or two, whereas she did continue to feed. So I would separate them periodically and feed her, and then put them back together again.
So you obviously you pulled the male from her enclosure to feed her and then offer him.
That's right. Yeah.
He continued not to show any interest during the whole reproductive cycle, right?
Yeah, you know, I think he might have eaten on one occasion or so, but generally he wasn't interested in food.
Now, okay, so which is interesting too, is I mean, it sounds like that pair was just absolutely perfect. They were compatible from the get-go, which is fantastic. Right. When I was asking if you had seen any kind of like urate or any discharge or anything like that from the female during the reproductive attempts, I'm going to ask if you, I mean, obviously I try to ask everybody that's had success with these, did you see any of this blood smear that I've heard about? I've never witnessed it myself, but I don't know if you're familiar with that, with the reproduction and all from some captive keepers.
To be honest with you, no, I didn't notice anything like that. But to be honest with you, Ari, it could be that I just wasn't really looking out for it. I mean, this is where, you know, I feel I might kind of be letting down the Boelens community a bit, because I tried to take, you know, data points, but I maybe wasn't as observant as I could have been with it, because, yeah, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, but I wasn't really looking for anything like that. So yeah, other than the kind of, you know, recording the temperature and recording what they were actually doing in terms of the courtship, I didn't notice anything else different or any secretions or anything like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I've heard from a couple keepers, as well as a few other taxa, you know, about during certain reproductive instances where the female, or from what we assume it came from the female, is almost like a blood smear that is on the back of the cage, on the glass or something like that. And it's still not really known where it derived from. My personal theory is that it's overzealous spurring around the female's cloaca, and maybe it kind of tears some of that tissue and then it causes that. But I don't know. That's the thing. So it's interesting.
Have you seen that yourself with your Boelens?
I've not experienced it with any of the reproductive behavior I've seen with any animals I personally worked with.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out really what that is. I mean, it's hard to kind of predict that, you know, and then, you know, a lot of times, I mean, some people go like more of a naturalistic enclosure, so they have a lot of decor, you know, vegetation, things like that, which can quickly absorb things like that where you wouldn't be able to see, versus somebody that's doing a very, you know, kind of monotone, simplistic setup, where obviously you could see anything and everything that's deposited. I know I'm going to reference Frederick again, just because he's had a lot of success with his, you know, he saw, you know, sperm discharge left in the male's water dish, things like that too during that side, which are all really interesting observations, especially during the reproductive stage. Did you see was there anything that really kind of like anything that really kind of struck you as maybe unique or odd during any of it that you were like, oh, that's interesting? Or was it pretty much just straightforward, like, you know, from what you're saying?
Yeah, it did seem to be pretty straightforward. I mean, again, my lack of experience with breeding pythons up to that point might have been a factor here. But yeah, I mean, the only thing was just how vigorous the spurring was, and I don't recall ever. Maybe I'd seen that with boas before, but it seemed to be more obvious, more prominent with the Boelens. So I don't know if that's a python thing in particular, but that was the only obvious thing really.
Yeah,
Was that element of the courtship.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear me, Ari. You've slightly frozen for me.
Triggered together for whatever reasoning, and everything went perfect, which is fantastic, which is so mind blowing to me, because we have people that are have been working with these animals for years, and still have not had success with doing the whole gauntlet of everything that we've tried. But the simplicity of what you've done, is just fantastic.
Right.
I commend you for that. It's so cool, man.
Thanks,
to be able
Ari,
to witness that and be able to be a part of doing.
Sorry, yeah, I know it's. I do suspect there was a lot of good fortune in it, and I don't know if there is a sort of mythical missing ingredient when it comes to successfully reproducing Boelens, but if there is, I don't know what it is. I mean, I kept them the same way I'd kept my diamond pythons, and I never managed to breed my diamonds. I've had them for 15 years. Well, they are 15 years old now. I've had them for 13 years. And the male diamond python never showed any interest in the female. So I never managed to breed them. And I didn't really do anything different with the Boelens. I think there's, as you said earlier, they may just happen to be a compatible pair. It's possible there's some accidental local environmental condition that played a part. When I was chatting to my friend Dean about it, a chap who worked in the reptile shop in South London, he commented that in spring 2024 it was really rainy in England, and I don't know if there was a lot of humidity in the air or something like that. But yeah, it really was. It was disarmingly straightforward, to be honest. And so much so that I kind of assumed that even though they were mating, I didn't hold out much hope that it would lead to successful ovulation or successful oviposition and hatchlings. I thought there would probably be something that would go wrong between the courtship and the actually getting babies.
Yeah, no, it's super. It was super cool when we started talking, and you were telling me about that, and then obviously you observed the female ovulate, and then shed. And at what point did you decide that it was time to pull the male out? Did you start seeing lack of interest from him, or was it just the female was kind of getting to that point where she was like, all right, I'm getting a little irritated by you, and she was obviously getting bigger, and it was like, okay, something's happening.
Yeah, so it was when the female went into slough. And sorry, earlier I think I called it the post-ovulation slough because I had my boa head on, but it would have the pre-lay slough is what I assumed it was. And and he actually at that point the male stopped showing interest in her, so I thought that'll be the time to pull them. So I separated them, and I tracked the dates in terms of how long it took the female to slough. And at that point, I thought, okay, there's a chance that she's gravid here. She certainly looked to be swollen in the abdomen. So I thought, there's a good chance this is an ovulation and there's something going on. So yeah, that was from that point on, they were separated.
Did you see any excessive basking behavior? Did she flip her body at all, or was it stereotypical, like what you would expect, or was she laying down like a flat tire, or was there anything?
There was a bit of all of that, to be honest. Yeah, so she would spend a lot of her time in her hide, which is big enough for her to fully kind of disappear into, that is under the heater, so kind of the warmest point in the vivarium. But then she would come out and she would sort of wrap herself around the water bowl, which is at the coolest point of the vivarium, and she would invert her belly. And that inversion was not something I'd seen before. I don't recall seeing boas do it, but I'd heard python breeders talk about that as a a sign of gravidity. So I thought that was a good sign. And she would do that a lot. Yeah, like her whole lower third would be substantially inverted, and she'd do that for large periods of the day.
Interesting. Could you, at any point, could you start to see like almost like the lumping when she was doing that?
To be honest, I didn't, but I've subsequently heard people talk about that, or almost trying to palpate. I think I would have been too afraid to do anything like that.
Yeah.
I didn't want to touch her or, anything. So no, it was just, a really appreciable, obvious swelling. After she sloughed, she had absolutely no interest in food at all, and that stayed the case until after she'd laid the clutch. But yeah, she just
now
continued.
when you said, I'm sorry. Well,
no worries, go on.
Now you said when she, after she did that shed, she had no interest in feeding. Obviously, when we say that for any newer people that are into herpetoculture, it's obviously they're not hungry to eat. Was there anything definitive? Was she wanted nothing to do with it at all, or was she kind of curious or anything like that?
As I recall, just no interest at all. Yeah, she wasn't. She was in no way aggressive or anything like that. Just complete disinterest when it came to offering food. And to be honest with you, I think I only did it once or twice, relatively early on after she sloughed, and then I sort of assumed she's good. From what I'd read, I assumed, in terms of python breeding, I assumed she'd have no interest from that point.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. It's always a weird behavior when you see an animal that's so actively interested in feeding, just decide to it's kind of like a light switch goes off and the animal has zero interest whatsoever, where you're just you're kind of pushing it at their face to say, hey, are you sure you don't want it? And they just there's no interest whatsoever. And it's also a super exciting sign, because it's either going to be,
yeah, you assume it's a sign of something good, but it's interesting because. Sorry, Ari, I don't mean to talk over you. I think we're getting a delay. Sorry, I know we've got a bit of a delay. Yeah, no, I was just going to say I contrast it with boas, because when
we're getting a little bit of feedback, but that's all right.
Okay, no worries. The female boas, in my experience, would keep eating until fairly close to parturition. So it's interesting that pythons don't. I don't know what the biological reason for that is.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I've seen it with the boas, but I've also seen it with the pythons too, where it's just like I said, it's like a light switch going off. And it's like a completely different behavior. Now, I remember when you sent me a picture of all those eggs. How long was the process, do you remember, from her going into her nest box and then depositing her eggs? Do you recall that, or?
Yeah, so I had a pretty good idea how, when she would lay, based on, again, what I was reading. I tried to find everything I could online. There's a Swiss chap called Marcus. I'm going to forget his surname now, but he published quite a lot of info about successful Boelens breeding. So I tried to sort of mine all the information he had. I also looked up a lot of information about people who'd bred other pythons in the scrub complex, because I assumed there'd be some commonalities there. And if I recall correctly, I might have to check my data here, but I think the figure I had in mind was about 28 to 30 days after the pre-lay slough, the oviposition would happen. So when we got fairly close to that, I moved the female from the 8-foot viv that she was in to a 4-foot plastic viv. And I put some sphagnum moss in the hide. I thought the plastic viv will tolerate high humidity. And I think I put her in there about 48 hours before I was expecting her to lay. And yeah, timing wise, it was bang on. So about the day before I thought she would probably lay, she came out, stretched out as far as she could in this relatively small viv. And she started twitching her body and lying under the heat source, sort of doing these rhythmic twitches. And again, I kind of Googled that because I'd not seen that before. And, I read that female pythons can do that in the run up to laying a clutch. Although I think I read that it could be like 12 to 72 hours or something. So I didn't know exactly how soon after that the clutch would be. But that evening, she laid the eggs, and I came down early in the morning, just kind of popped the hide up, and I could see her sitting on the eggs, which was an amazing sight. So yeah, it was timing wise, it was all fortunately, based on the information I'd read from other people, I was able to get it fairly accurate.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I speak with Scott Flood frequently also, and he's had a lot of successes within these last few years on his stuff. And he sent me some really fantastic videos of his, excuse me, his gravid females where they're doing that typical Python twitch, and it's just so cool looking.
Nice.
So I can only imagine. And I've never witnessed in the wild one doing twitches. So I don't know if I just happened to be at the wrong time, but I've never seen it in the wild. I mean, I've seen plenty of females sitting on eggs, and I've seen females that are gravid getting close to getting close to laying eggs, but I've never actually seen wild twitching behavior, which would be something really neat to record.
Interesting.
I noticed when you sent me photos of the eggs, and it was 15, I believe, eggs that you had produced.
Yeah, it was something like, I think it might have been 17, but one or two of them were obviously slugs. So, I think it might have been 16 eggs that looked as if they had the potential to be fertile, but one of them looked pretty dodgy from the off.
Okay.
So kind of 15 potentially good eggs. Yeah, and I didn't know what I was expecting in terms of clutch size, but it felt larger than I was expecting because she was a first-time breeder. I was probably expecting maybe like 8 or 9 or something like that.
How big?
How big were the eggs? Yeah.
How big was the female?
Oh, the female. Okay, so she would have been, in the region of 8 feet at this point, maybe a little bigger. It's funny. I mean, I do know that actually, as we were talking about recently, I've actually recently sold them as a breeding pair, so I no longer own them. But now they are so much bigger than they were when they bred last year. It's actually, looking back on photos, it's amazing how much they've grown since then. So yeah, wow. She would have been around about 8.5 feet, but not especially chunky, especially compared to how she is now. So yeah, I didn't expect a big clutch, to be honest with you. I thought it would be 7 or 8, something like that. So it was a surprise to see that many eggs.
Yeah, that's a big clutch, that's a respectable clutch. I know you sent me. I was like hounding you for getting weights on the eggs and measurements on the eggs just for data. So I remember looking at all the weight. I even wrote them all down just so I could go over them again with you. So like most of those eggs were like, what were they like? I can't remember what it was on my notes here. And I put them somewhere else, of course. But for the most part, that they were all relatively around the same weight, I believe. Maybe a few of them were a little bit larger.
Yeah, there were a couple that seemed appreciably larger, but I don't recall if that made a big difference in the weight. To be honest with you, and this is where, again, because you're so good at stats and measurements and everything and all of that kind of insight, and I'm not so good at taking recording data. So I think I only weighed a couple of the eggs, or maybe a handful of them. And it was pretty consistent in terms of their size. Yeah.
Now, one of the other things too that I remember looking at on the photos is the texture of the shell. It wasn't smooth all the way around. It almost had some like rough kind of like I don't even know how to describe it. Kind of the texture was really rough looking.
Yeah, they did. They had these. A lot of them had these kind of little tiny, almost circular bobbles on them. To me, I told myself they look healthy because they were plump and they were bright white, but I didn't really know what those bobbles meant exactly, or if that's something you would typically see or not.
Yeah, no, it was interesting because I looked at them because all the eggs that I've seen, personally, are all in the wild, and they're all very different looking. They look like marshmallows essentially when the females wrap around them all. And for the most part, they're very uniformly smooth. But yours had but I've seen a lot of captive, produced eggs, and they have like very kind of like almost like a dimpling kind of rough outer shell look to them on certain spots. Yeah. When you started incubating, obviously too, Now, when you removed the eggs from the female, how was her behavior towards you? Was she showing any signs of aggression, curiosity,
No, she wasn't. No, I mean, I was expecting to get bitten, but she was fine. She was really calm. She just let me lift her off the clutch. And then I just kind of tucked her away, and then it was very straightforward just to move them from that point. So yeah, it was interesting because I don't know why that would be, because you'd think, that their instinct is obviously to maternally incubate. So I would have assumed she would want to fend off anyone who wants to come between her and the eggs. So I don't know why she wasn't aggressive. I mean, maybe it's, the captive environment kind of modifies behavior somehow. I'm really not sure, but yeah, I was glad I didn't get tagged.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, no, it's an interesting behavior for sure. At what point did you start offering food again for her when she was done, with the whole process of everything?
It was either the same day or the next day. I'd have to check my notes exactly. Wow. I know I wanted to put her in a vivarium that was, all cleaned up and free of the scent of eggs, because I thought she might have the instinct to maternally incubate if she could smell anything, and that might put her off feeding. So put her in a fully clean vivarium, and almost instantly she wanted to feed again, which was interesting. And wow, I was surprised how good she looked for having dropped a big clutch as well. I mean, I was kind of expecting the bottom third of her would just be completely, flattened and hollowed out, but she looked pretty good. And to be honest with you, within a couple of weeks when she was feeding again, it was, to me anyway, it was almost hard to tell she'd been through growing and laying a clutch of eggs.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's they're, incredible animals, like what they can do. It's like, they go off feed for so long, and then, like you said, they pass 17 essentially objects out of their body. They don't even look like they've lost a gram of weight of anything. Did you have any issues when you started when you were incubating? Because I know we had talked a little bit, and then you had reached out to Frederick also, and a couple other people with some humidity issues, I guess. Can you go into that a little bit? Or
yeah, definitely. I mean, I made some mistakes, to be honest with you, with the incubation. And again, this is where my kind of naivety when it comes to breeding and egg laying, Boyd, comes to the fore. With boas, it's all very straightforward. They do all the work for you. The incubation setup I had was a little bit basic. So I had an 18-liter rub, really useful box, with vermiculite in it. And initially I had some ventilation holes. And then the lid for those boxes, it tightly clips on, but it doesn't create an airtight seal. And I put this in a plastic vivarium. You can probably see top right behind me now. I just controlled the temperature through the usual heater with sort of a heat mat type thing linked to a stat. And I just assumed that being in the box with the vermiculite would be enough in terms of humidity. But I was due to go on a short holiday very shortly after she laid the eggs. So I set them up as best I could. But my main concern was, based on some experiences I'd had with hognose snake eggs where they got kind of moldy, where it was too humid, my main concern was that while I was away, I might leave the eggs too moist and too damp. So I was trying to think, what's the best thing to do? And I kind of kept adding air holes, and I kept telling myself, God, you need a bit more ventilation. And as a result, I got that wrong. So I had a couple of cameras looking at the eggs while I was away. And as a few days passed, I could see that the ones that were closest to the ventilation, the air holes, they started to get kind of bobbly. They almost looked like a kind of mogul ski piece. And I was trying to tell myself from a distance, looking over this camera, I'm sure that's normal, I'm sure it's okay. But I got back after I think it was 4 days away, and those eggs near the ventilation, they didn't look right. I think it was about 4 of them. They didn't look, as plump and healthy anymore as the other ones did. So and Frederick hadn't warned me about this. I think he'd said with one of his early clutches he'd had too much ventilation and some of them had collapsed, and he'd been able to rehydrate them. So I immediately sealed all the air holes. So now we just had the little bit of ventilation that came from the seal not being airtight. and that's how they stayed from that point on until hatching. And it looked as if the bobbly eggs were gonna carry on, but then when I candled the eggs a few days after that, the bobbly eggs, I'm trying to remember exactly what happened. I think some of the bobbly eggs were fertile, but they subsequently didn't make it. They collapsed or they went moldy, and clearly they were potentially good eggs that I lost because I had too much ventilation. So bit of a painful lesson to learn. And maybe the best thing would have been to have a sort of professional incubator rather than a rough and ready setup. But lesson learned.
Yeah, it happens. Can't win them all, But if anything, it's what you learn from it. I mean, I hear certain people have issues with their eggs. I've not had the experience yet. I hope to soon, eventually, to be able to to figure that out as well. But I've also heard that they've had problems with the eggs drying out too quickly. And issues related to that too. So I mean, obviously, we're still at the infancy stage of what we're doing with these animals that seem to work, let alone getting to the reproductive side of it. So we're still learning, but I mean, it's still quite an achievement on your behalf to have produced as many as you did, and to do it on your first run, which is a big pat on your back for sure. I mean, it's pretty awesome. Did you so your temperatures for when you were incubating, what was your temperature and humidity? Do you remember?
So it ended up, I monitored the temperatures very closely. It ended up being on average about 30.5 degrees. So that's, I guess, about 87, 88 Fahrenheit.
Okay.
So Frederick told me that with his first clutch, which I think was in 2013 for him, he said he thought he incubated them at too high a temperature. I think he said 31.5 degrees. And the impression he got from that was that the incubation was maybe a little bit too fast, and the hatchlings came out of the eggs with very thick umbilicus that took them a while to absorb. So I had that in mind. I thought, okay, let's try and aim for 29.5 degrees, 30, so sort of like late 80s Fahrenheit. And actually, I think because there was a light in the vivarium that would raise the temperature very slightly, but that wasn't really being picked up by the thermostat. In the daytime, it would actually raise the temperature to about 31 degrees. So again, trying to translate that, it's maybe 89 Fahrenheit. I might have got that wrong, but yeah. And then at night, that light would be off, but the thermostat would still be doing its thing because I left the heating on 24/7, and that would bring the temperature down to about 30. So on average, across day and night, it was about 30.5 degrees, I think.
And your humidity was upper 90 plus. Super humid. You were maintaining.
Yeah, it was 100% the whole time. It was. I had this notion that I probably needed to circulate air in the incubator, because one of the things I was most concerned about was the idea of mold. And again, this is because I'd seen this in hognose snakes or some colubrids before. I just thought, if mold gets onto one of the eggs, maybe it'll spread. And it was the thing I was most nervous about, to be honest. So I used to pop the lid and circulate the air quite regularly, and then, pop it, and the humidity, and that would very briefly bring the humidity down. But then soon after that, it would get back up to 100% again. And I was, this is kind of weird, really. It probably makes me sound a bit stupid, but I was worried that there wouldn't be enough oxygen in the really useful box, even though it wasn't airtight. I kept kind of picturing I don't really know whether eggs whether they exchange air with the environment or not. As you can tell, I'm probably don't know as much about this stuff as I should. But I wasn't sure if they'd have enough oxygen or if they'd use up the oxygen that was in the incubator. And so I felt like I really needed to pop the lid and do that. So much so that when they were about halfway through incubating, I had another short holiday in the UK. And halfway through that, I drove home 200 miles purely to pop the lid, lift it, circulate the air a bit, put it on again, and then drive back up to resume the holiday, because I was just really worried that there wouldn't be enough oxygen. And I bought an oxygen meter that I could read over the cameras remotely. But it didn't really work because it couldn't cope with the humidity. So it just started setting off these crazy alarms and giving me false readings. But yeah.
I was going to ask you, that would be really interesting to know what that was.
Yeah. Well, when I briefly got readings from it, in the periods before it would start going haywire because of the humidity, it would be something like 20.5% oxygen. So, very close to atmospheric oxygen. And I think when I actually, after the snakes hatched, I then did some tests with, where the eggs went in there, and I could be a bit more relaxed about the tests I was doing and not have the humidity. And I found that, the background level of atmospheric oxygen was basically what you got in the box with the lid on. So there was really no need for me to have been popping the lid and circulating air. I could probably have left it the whole time and they would have been fine. But yeah, it was just something I had on my mind. Would they have enough oxygen?
Interesting. No, that's cool. That's cool to know. Now, what was the was it 71 days, I believe, for your hatching?
It was longer, actually. I thought it was going to be 70 days because I'd read a couple of people online saying the scrub python complex, it's 70 days. And, I wanted it to be 70 days because I didn't want to wait any longer. And so I had that marked in my diary and was eagerly awaiting it. But 70 days came and went, and there was no sign of any hatching. And I was really nervous about the possibility of the snakes, being fully developed, but never successfully pipping the eggs and drowning in shell, which would have been just heartbreaking to have fully developed Boelens pythons somehow not hatching. And again, I keep coming back to this, but lack of experience with egg-laying species. I'd never cut eggs before. I'd never done that. And I was very nervous about doing it. I think I asked Frederick for advice and he gave me a steer on how to do it. And I thought, okay, if we get to like 75, 76 days, maybe I'll cut an egg or two. But then I started reading a couple more sources online, and some people were saying the scrub python complex, they can go 80 days, maybe even 85. And I thought, okay, maybe if I cut them, it'll be premature. So it got to 78 days. I think that's right. I might have to check my stats. And without me cutting, without me cutting the first egg pipped. And then once that had pipped, again, this was Frederick's advice. He said, when the first one pips, cut at least some of the others, because you'll know if one has pipped, they're probably all fully developed. So you're probably not going to do any harm cutting at that stage. But interestingly, the first one, there was a big gap between the first one pipping and the next one. I haven't come armed with the data, although I did record it all. I think it was at least 36 hours or something like that before the second egg pipped. Wow. And I was a bit concerned about it. And even the eggs that I then cut, I didn't see any babies come to the fore. And in the meantime, the first hatchling, after 12 hours or so, she came fully out. But when she did, I noticed that she had a really big, thick umbilicus, which was something that Frederick had talked about. So then I thought, okay, maybe she's premature. Maybe the reason she's hatched and the others haven't is because she's a bit early. And so then I kind of relaxed a bit about the idea of the others hatching, and I thought, okay, maybe they need a couple more days. And sure enough, it was 80 days before they started hatching in number, and they still did it on a very piecemeal way. It was kind of one or two per day, all the way up to I think 85 days. And the impression I was left with from that is, the snakes in the python complex, they really do, I think, need 80 days. I mean, maybe you could get it faster with higher temperatures. But yeah, I mean, to anyone breeding them in future, I would say, don't get nervous about 80 days coming without seeing any babies, because it does seem like that's how long this species takes.
That's interesting. When they once they hatched, did you notice anything different as far as their activity after they first shed? I know I spoke to Frederick when he had his babies, and he said that they were very, very like overly shy up until that first shed, where they had like no interest to really venture out. They were just kind of hiding most of the time. Did you see anything kind of similar to that?
I think they didn't all hide, to be honest with you. Some of them did, some didn't. They were very aggressive, very snappy, which I took to be a broadly good sign, because they seemed like, healthy, lively. But yeah, they were really, really nippy. And anytime I opened the lids, they just wanted to to strike at me, they'd go into the defensive S and get ready to strike. But no, they actually, some of them I recall being reasonably active, which again I took as maybe a sign that they would be ready to start feeding or whatever. But as it turned out, it absolutely wasn't.
Okay. Well, at what point did you start offering food? Like how soon was it after they hatched, or did you wait after their first shed, or
Yeah, I waited until their first shed, and to be honest with you, that this was. I mean, I had expected things to go wrong all the way through the breeding process. I thought, the female will reabsorb the clutch, or the eggs won't be fertile, or they won't make it. I thought that would be the hard bit. I thought once they hatched, I thought it would be easy, to be honest with you, because mine from a young age had fed so readily, despite having had the trauma of the transit from Indonesia. I thought captive bred Boelens, I'm sure they'll snap at rodents straight away, and that they absolutely didn't. So I offered them food after their first slough, each of them, and none of them were interested at all. And then I thought, okay, maybe I'm getting this wrong in terms of the prey item or the temperature. And I tried warming. I was using fuzzy mice. I tried warming them up, but yeah, absolutely zero interest in feeding, and that continued for some time, to be honest. So much so I was like, okay, I'm going to have a bit of a problem on my hands here.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. Quite a few keepers have asked me on feeding techniques for neonates and babies for that matter. And for whatever reason, sometimes they have issues, sometimes they don't, and a lot of it comes down to like kind of waiting them out and picking something that they really show an interest to. And I've had a lot of success just kind of doing that, very, very slow approach where you're almost kind of pushing it at their mouth a little bit, and then they'll just kind of barely open their mouth and then start eating.
Okay. Yeah. No, I didn't. In the end, I didn't get anywhere with that. I tried teasing, and because they were naturally quite aggressive and snappy, I thought, if I kind of tease them, at one point, one of them is going to just grab this thing, and maybe it's going to realize it's food and it's going to go for it. But it didn't happen. And pushing it up against their mouth didn't work. The thing that did eventually work was leaving warmed prey items in with them overnight. But that took me a long time to realize, and I had to switch from rodents to quails, and it took me a while to do that, because one of them did actually take a fuzzy mouse, the first of them to feed, female number 2, I think it was. And once she had done that, I thought, okay, she ate it while it was left with her overnight. I thought, okay, the others are going to start doing that too, but they never did. And so weeks passed, and she was still the only one that had fed, and she showed no interest in feeding a second time. So I was doing all this research, seeing what I could find out about what they might feasibly eat. And I ordered in some quails, which is not the kind of food I would normally have, because I don't have anything that eats quails. So I got, frozen quails. I snipped the beak, snipped the legs to try and make them as small and digestible as possible. Warmed them up, left them in overnight, and still several attempts went by with absolutely no luck. But then one or two of them started taking them overnight. And then I thought, okay, if a couple of them are feeding, I'm sure the others will kick in before too long.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And then after that, obviously, they started, feeding readily for you then, obviously, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about readily actually. A few of them, so bear in mind, there were 10 babies that made it. When I candled them, there were 14 fertile eggs, and then a few of them went bad and obviously weren't going to make it. And come the point of hatching, I had 11 good eggs that I thought were going to make it. And I had a 12th that had gone kind of moldy. So I had separated it and was incubating it separately. And I didn't think that one stood a chance of hatching. And of those 11 eggs in the main incubator, I got 10 good babies. The 11th one, I had picked the egg, and I'd had a little look inside, and it looked like it was going to be the last to hatch, but I could see a live baby in there moving. And then like 6-7 hours went past and it never showed its head. So I thought I'll intervene, and I found it drowned, dead. So I guess somehow it couldn't get out from under the yolk. I do recall that one was its body was underneath the yolk, which was unusual because the others were on top of it. So I guess maybe it couldn't get out. And obviously in hindsight, I should have, manually hatched it out of the egg, but I didn't know. And then the 12th egg, the one that had gone bad, it didn't show any signs of hatching. So on about day 87, I cut it. And I found a fully developed dead baby, but with a heavily kinked spine. So I don't think it was ever going to make it. So I had 10 good, live, healthy babies, seemingly. And a good few of them started eating frozen, defrosted quails within a few weeks. It could take a few weeks. But several others, they still refused food, and in the end, I had to try live quails with them. And I don't feed live normally, so I had to obtain some fertile quail eggs and incubate them, and go through the whole process of waiting for that, which was 21 days or something. And then at first, again, no interest, but then a couple of them started taking the live, and then eventually all but 2 of them did. And the ones that were on live, it then was able over time to convert them to defrosted quails. But 2 of the babies never fed, and eventually they died of starvation.
Oh no! Yeah. Now, you don't currently work with Boelens anymore, correct? You said you would have gotten rid of your animals.
Yeah, I did. It was kind of a tough decision, but they needed a bit more space, to be honest with you. So when I bred them, and they were appreciably smaller than they are now, they were in 6 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot vivariums. And while they were courting, they were in a much bigger 8 foot by 3 foot tall vivarium. But then I put my diamond pythons back in that 8 footer. And I needed bigger vivariums for the Boelens. I bought some 8 foot vivariums, but I was having some trouble trying to accommodate them in the space behind me. And the snakes got bigger and bigger, especially this year. I mean, they really just got so much bigger. And I started thinking, should I hold on to them and try and breed them again? Or, should I see if there's someone who's going to give them a really big, maybe even a sort of zoo style enclosure and wants to have a crack at breeding them themselves? And I reached out to a guy who had bought several of the hatchlings last year and asked if he'd be interested. And he said he was. And he's been building them a really big naturalistic enclosure where I'm sure they're going to live a great life. So I decided to make the call and sell them. And it's funny. It's incredibly rewarding keeping them, but I never felt attached to them as pets in the way that I have for some other animals. Like my diamond pythons, I'm really attached to, and I know it's funny with the Boelens. I never quite felt that same link. I don't really know why that is. So it wasn't too after a call to sell them.
Yeah, it'll be. That's an interesting situation. Yeah, it's strange. I guess each animal's, you'll relate differently to certain things. I'm excited to find out though if you're the individual that you ended up sending, we'll call it Mr. X, make it all mysterious. If Mr. X will have any have any luck with your animals, now that they've been proven to breed, and he's got essentially a big group. So it'll be interesting to follow up with that. One of the things as we're wrapping this up, one of my questions was, how do you see captive breeding projects contributing to the conservation of Boelens pythons?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess the main way in which they could do that is if there is a ready supply of captive bred animals, then there ceases to be a demand for wild caught or captive farmed animals. As we've seen for so many species over the decades, as they come to be bred regularly in captivity, then there's no need for people to. Well, I guess there's no commercial imperative for people to trade wild caught animals because the wild caught examples are less desirable, and the people trading them will make less money off them. With the Australian species, for example, I know there have been problems with animals being smuggled out of Australia for decades now because Australia hasn't really had an export trade, a legal export trade in its native species. But because most of the Australian herps have been successfully bred around the world, there's probably, I assume, there's no real demand for someone to, illegally export a diamond python or a knob-tailed gecko or a rough-scaled python or something like that. So, absolutely, if there is a ready supply of captive-bred Boelens, you'd hope that it's going to mean that they're going to have a better chance in the wild. What I've always hoped with Boelens is because they live in this very remote area, which obviously you've seen up close, and I would love to have the chance to do that myself. I kind of assume in my head they're fairly well protected because they're on this truly massive island and they're in this fairly inaccessible location. So I'm guessing it's probably quite hard for people to go deep into their habitat and kind of raid the populations. Is that true, or are they subject to being taken from the wild a lot?
Yes and no. Yes and no, I would say. The habitat is very difficult to access. Obviously, it's only accessible by locals because you're having to deal with local landowners and things like that. So you couldn't just get off plane and walk out and to go look for a Boelens python. You're going to have a heap of trouble following you either up there or on the way back, but you're going to have issues. So it is, and obviously just the remoteness and the inaccessibility of some of those areas, obviously are helping protect the species, I feel, and kind of shroud it more in mystery as far as for us to be able to obtain more information with it. But yeah, I feel like that does play a big factor. For my last question, before I call this episode a good night and let you get some sleep, because I'm sure it's we're getting into 1 or 2 in the morning over there now. What are your thoughts on the role of private collections versus zoos in safeguarding species, in particular Boelens pythons?
Oh, it's interesting. I do think that herpetoculture is often looked down upon by professional biologists and zoologists, or people who are involved in things at the zoological level, when in actual fact an awful lot of amateur keepers, or even people who breed commercially but privately, have a great deal of knowledge about the animals, and that can translate into being responsible for captive bred populations being regularly kept and taking pressure off wild-caught animals. So I'm sure there's a huge amount of knowledge out there. I personally don't really know people involved in keeping and breeding animals in zoos. So I don't know if those people are willing, that there's people working in zoos are willing to reach out to the private keepers, the amateurs, and tap them for knowledge. As far as I know, the Boelens aren't being regularly bred in zoos around the world, but clearly there are a few private keepers who are doing it, Frederick and Scott and other people. It's interesting. I guess zoos have a challenge in that for a lot of the time they have to keep their animals on display to the public, which maybe compromises having an optimal setup, because that they have to ensure that they're not always hidden away. Which maybe sometimes conflicts with what you might want for an animal in terms of it being in optimal conditions for breeding. So yeah, it's interesting. But having said that, I keep an eye on what places like ZSL, the Zoological Society of London, do in terms of captive breeding and conservation, and they do some absolutely incredible work. So yeah, I wouldn't want to assume that they wouldn't be able to crack it as well.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question to ask. I have a lot of experience. I spent a decade in the zoological community professionally, and now and obviously going back and forth in the private sector as well too. And it's a different world, different mentality, different goals. So it could be a whole show topic. But I just wanted to thank you so much, Paul, for coming on. It's been a pleasure to pick your brain and hear about your fantastic achievement, and obviously see the passion that you have for these animals as well as we all do. I just really wanted to thank you for taking the time. And like I said, I know it's really late, so it really means a lot to me, man. So I just wanted to thank you for that personally.
No worries, Ari. No, it's a pleasure, and I'm honored that you wanted me to come on and talk here. And I'm just sorry that I maybe didn't have as much insight in terms of the low-level data or any kind of hints or tricks when it comes to Boelen reproduction. Like I say, I think I got pretty fortunate. I think they were the right animals at the right time and maybe quite compatible. And so if there is some kind of mystical secret to breeding them, I don't know the answer, unfortunately, but I wish everyone who's keeping these animals every success in future, and I hope we'll have a thriving captive bred population in the long term.
Well, we can hope, and obviously, you've really contributed a lot, regardless if you hadn't measured every egg that I asked you to measure for me, or take every measurement for me. All the information that you've collected and shared with us it's been fabulous, and it's going into more data that we can archive to just help progress forward with the species and make this something that we're able to, control a little bit better. So with that being said, thank you again. I also, if you guys are enjoying me putting these podcasts out, please follow Project Black Python, the Boelens Python Roundtable, and obviously the Trap Talk Reptile Network. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time. So have a great night. And thanks again, Paul. We'll talk soon, buddy.
Thanks, Harry. Good night.